On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft crossed into Hawaiian airspace. They came in two waves, separated by 45 minutes, and within 110 minutes they had reshaped the course of the war. 6 American battleships sank or were beached. 2,403 Americans died. Japan's military leadership celebrated. They had executed one of the most tactically precise surprise attacks in modern warfare, and they had made the single worst strategic decision of the entire conflict. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not an isolated act of aggression. It was the culmination of a 4-year chain of miscalculations, each one feeding the next, rooted in a fundamental misreading of American character, industrial capacity, and political will. What makes this story worth examining closely is not the attack itself. Hundreds of accounts document the planes, the timing, the damage. The real story lies in what Japanese planners believed would happen after the bombs fell. That belief was wrong in almost every dimension that mattered. To understand the full weight of the mistake, you need to go back to 1937, when Japan was already 4 years into its campaign in Manchuria and launched a full-scale invasion of mainland China. By 1941, Japan had committed over 600,000 troops to the Chinese theater and was consuming roughly 12,000 tons of oil per day across its military and industrial operations. The problem was that Japan produced almost none of its own oil. Roughly 80% of its petroleum came from a single source, the United States. When Washington responded to the Nanjing massacre and the escalating Chinese campaign by imposing an oil embargo in July 1941, Japan's war planners calculated they had roughly 18 months of fuel reserves. At current consumption rates, that gave them until early 1943 before their ships stopped moving, their aircraft stopped flying, and their entire war machine ground to a halt. The math was brutal and simple. Japan had to either abandon China, 4 years of war, over 100,000 military dead, and enormous national prestige, or find another source of oil fast. The Dutch East Indies held the answer. Modern Indonesia sat on some of the richest petroleum reserves in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan could seize it. But doing so meant pushing through the Philippines, which meant directly challenging American military power in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who planned the Pearl Harbor operation, argued that the only way to execute a southern advance without facing American naval interference was to knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet first. The logic was tactically coherent. The strategy beneath it was not. Here is what Yamamoto and the Imperial General Staff actually believed would happen. After the strike, the United States would recognize Japan's dominance in the Western Pacific, sue for a negotiated peace, and effectively concede the region. Japan would then build what its planners called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a self-sufficient imperial bloc stretching from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies, insulated from Western economic pressure. The entire plan rested on this assumption, and the assumption had no serious basis in evidence. American public opinion before December 7th was deeply divided on whether to enter the European War. But military intervention in Asia to defend Pacific territories was broadly supported. The Philippines were an American commonwealth. Guam and Wake Island were American territory. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it did not create a reluctant, conflicted American public that might eventually accept a negotiated peace. It created a unified, furious one. The Senate voted for war 82-0. The House voted 388-1. That single dissenting vote, cast by Jeanette Rankin of Montana, was the full extent of American opposition to the war Japan had just started. What becomes clear when you study the planning sessions at Imperial General Headquarters in late 1941 is that the strategists who pushed for the attack were operating with almost no reliable intelligence about American industrial capacity or political psychology. They had good intelligence on ship placements, harbor depths, and patrol schedules. They had almost nothing useful on what America could build and how fast it could build it. The numbers here are staggering, and they need to be understood in sequence. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the United States was producing roughly 50,000 aircraft per year across all categories. By 1944, that figure had climbed to 96,000. Japan peaked at 28,000 aircraft produced in 1944 a year, when American factories were outbuilding them by a ratio of more than 3-to-1. American shipyards launched 17 fleet carriers and over 100 escort carriers during the war. Japan launched 17 carriers total across the entire conflict. The industrial gap was not a factor Japan could close. It was a canyon. Yamamoto himself seems to have understood this intuitively. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He reportedly warned the government before the war that Japan could fight brilliantly for 1 year, perhaps 18 months, but could not sustain a prolonged conflict against American industry. His own plan, the one he designed and executed, required American psychological collapse to work. When that collapse did not come, when instead America spent the next 12 months replacing lost ships, training pilots, and reorganizing its Pacific Command, the Pearl Harbor attack had achieved nothing except awakening a productive capacity that Japan could never match. The tactical damage at Pearl Harbor was significant, but narrower than it appeared. The attack sank, or heavily damaged, 8 battleships: the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the California, the West Virginia, and 4 others. But 3 elements critical to Pacific naval power survived entirely untouched. All 3 American aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet were at sea that morning. The Enterprise was 215 miles west of Hawaii, returning from Wake Island. The Lexington was 460 miles southeast of Midway. The Saratoga was on the west coast, undergoing repairs. Every carrier escaped. The Japanese strike force, under Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, considered a third wave to destroy the fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, approximately 4.5 million barrels of oil stored in surface tanks, and the submarine base and repair docks. Nagumo declined, fearing American counterattack and wishing to preserve his strike force. That decision, made within 2 hours of the initial attack, meant Pearl Harbor remained operational. Within days, it was functioning as a forward naval base. Within weeks, American carriers were operating from it aggressively. Naval historians often highlight the carrier question as the pivotal failure of the operation. Battleships, it turned out, were already the past. The Pacific War would be decided by carrier aviation, and Japan had failed to find or destroy a single American carrier on December 7th. The battle that demonstrated this most conclusively came 6 months later, 450 miles northwest of Honolulu. Midway, fought between the 4th and 7th of June, 1942, became the hinge point of the Pacific War. Japan committed 4 fleet carriers: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, along with 148 support vessels and nearly 100,000 personnel across the full operation. The Japanese strike force planned to seize Midway Atoll, draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers, and establish a defensive perimeter that would force a negotiated settlement. The plan required surprise. They had none. American cryptanalysts had broken enough of Japan's naval code to determine the target, the date, the 4th of June, and the general approach vector. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his 3 available carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, 250 miles northeast of Midway, outside Japanese search patterns. In 5 minutes between 10:22 and 10:27 on the morning of June 4th, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown hit 3 Japanese carriers almost simultaneously. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were caught with loaded aircraft on their decks, fuel lines exposed, and ordnance stacked in the open during a frantic rearming operation. All 3 were fatally damaged within those 5 minutes. The Hiryu survived long enough to launch 2 strike waves that seriously damaged the Yorktown, but American aircraft found and destroyed her that afternoon. Japan lost all 4 carriers, 248 aircraft, and critically, approximately 220 highly trained and irreplaceable naval aviators who had formed the core of the Pearl Harbor strike force. The aviator losses deserve emphasis because they reveal a structural problem Japan had no solution to. Training a competent naval aviator in the 1940s took between 2 and 3 years. Japan's pre-war training program was exceptional but small. It produced elite pilots in limited numbers. At Pearl Harbor, Midway, the Coral Sea, and the successive carrier battles of 1942 and 43, Japan was spending pilots it could not replace at a rate that American training programs could more than compensate for. By late 1943, new American pilots entering combat had received 500 or more hours of flight time. Japanese replacements were entering battle with under 100 hours. The quality gap that had made Japanese naval aviation so lethal in 1941 was gone, and it was not coming back. When you trace the full chain from the oil embargo to the Southern Advance Strategy, to the Pearl Harbor decision to Midway, to the grinding attrition of 1943, a single thread runs through it. Japan went to war to secure resources it needed to sustain a war it was already fighting. The logic was circular from the start. Pearl Harbor was meant to buy time and space for an empire that could then become self-sufficient. Instead, it triggered the one-force full American industrial mobilization that made self-sufficiency irrelevant. Japan was not outfought in 1945. It was outbuilt in 1942. The greatest military mistake Japan made in World War II was not the tactical execution at Pearl Harbor, which was genuinely brilliant. It was the assumption that tactical brilliance could substitute for strategic reality. A nation of 130 million people and an economy producing roughly 1/9 of American industrial output attacked the world's largest economy and expected a negotiated peace within months. The carriers were not at Pearl Harbor. The fuel tanks survived, the repair docks kept working, and across the next 6 months, American industry proved every one of Yamamoto's private warnings correct. He reportedly said, after Pearl Harbor, that he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant. What the record shows is that he understood exactly what he had done and did it anyway, because the alternative was retreat, and retreat was politically impossible. That tension between what the military knew and what the political system would accept is the real explanation for Japan's biggest mistake. It was not a failure of intelligence or courage. It was a failure to match ends to means at the highest level of national strategy, with the entire war hanging on the outcome.